Hi, and welcome to the 34th installment of the Dad Project. I'll start by mentioning something I've noted several times before. When my father went through the service selection process at the Naval Academy, his first choice was Naval Air. From there, the story goes that since he wanted to fly, why not fly as much as possible? And if so, that would be anti-submarine warfare, ASW. Whether he was carrier-based or shore-based, that meant life in a propeller-driven aircraft powered by leaky and deafening radial engines, either the Grumman S2F or the Lockheed T2V. Eventually, the jet engine would be introduced to the ASW community with the carrier-based Lockheed S3 Viking and the shore-based Lockheed P3 Orion, but by that time my dad was out of the ASW pipeline. If not for Operation Rolling Thunder, chances are he would have continued life in the ASW community, but that meat grinder needed fighter bomber pilots, not sub-chasers. The needs of the Navy had plucked this experienced ASW and well-trained test pilot from his propeller-driven life and dropped him into the cockpit of an F-4B Phantom to deliver ordnance. On the face of it, this seems like a quantum leap from his life puttering over the waves of the North Atlantic in an S2F tracker to a Mach 2 capable fighter. But his interim step in test pilot school had introduced him to jet flying that included the F-11F, F-4D, and the F-8U. However, tonight's installment is about the jet trainer and company that made it. That was my father's introduction to flying jets while at test pilot school, the Lockheed T2V-1. So let's get started with a closer look at the T2V's maker, Lockheed. But first, you know the drill. Let's listen to Orson Welles recite John Gillespie's High Flight.
Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter's silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds, and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the windswept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touch the face of God.
In Lockheed Martin's 1998 annual report, Vance Kaufman, CEO, and Peter Tietz, COO, introduced the report as follows. Dear fellow shareholder, Lockheed Martin has now been in existence for only 4 years, but one of the real strengths of our corporation is that we can trace our roots back to the earliest days of aviation pioneers. Today, we are a strong, well-balanced aerospace, defense, and information technology corporation, positioned to achieve consistent, profitable growth. We derive our strength from our ability to leverage our most valuable assets, our people, our technology, and our diversity. This shorthand condenses years of corporate history of both Lockheed and Martin that included acquisitions, near bankruptcy, government bailout, renaming, international bribery, and relocation, among others. To put it another way, it was the history of a typical modern defense aerospace conglomerate. For our purposes, we will concentrate on the Lockheed half of the company. That began in early 1916 when the three Lockheed brothers formed the Lockheed Aircraft Company to develop its F-1 flying boat. With some commercial success under their belts, Brother Allen went to Washington, D.C. in hopes of securing a military contract for the F-1. However, he returned with a contract to build 2 Curtiss HS-2L flying boats and an agreement for the Navy to test the F-1. A year later, the Navy did test the F-1 when it completed a nonstop, record-setting flight from Santa Barbara to San Diego. However, by this time, the Navy was flush with Curtiss flying boats and chose not to go forward with the F-1. Even had Lockheed been able to procure a contract for its F-1, the end of the war would throw every aircraft manufacturer into an inescapable predicament. In fiscal year 1919, for obvious reasons, the Army Air Services budget was $925 million. In fiscal year 1920, that appropriation dropped to $25 million. The end of the war and a limited budget would mean the Army Air Corps needed considerably fewer aircraft. In the public sector, that translated to 90% of the aircraft manufacturers shuttering their doors. Following the lack of contract for the F-1 and the end of the war, the brothers decided that what the public wanted was an everyman's airplane, an equal of the Ford Model T. They may have been right, but the glut of surplus Curtiss Jennies that were available for as little as $300 made the S-1's $2,500 price tag well out of the reach of every man's pocketbook. So, despite spending $30,000 to develop the S-1, they didn't have a single order. The end of the war and Curtiss did Lockheed in twice. Lockheed would shutter their doors along with the numerous other manufacturers. This, however, would be short-lived as the plethora of engineering talent and relationships built up through various aircraft design and production efforts concentrated in Southern California would lend themselves to the explosion of financing available on the back of the Roaring Twenties and the hysteria surrounding Charles Lindbergh's Atlantic crossing. Like the movie industry, aircraft manufacturers had made their way to Southern California to take advantage of the continuous sunshine and warm weather. There were very few reasons to keep a test aircraft in the hangar. It would be Brother Allen who would reform the Lockheed Aircraft Company in 1926 with this phonetical spelling of his name. He would work with Jack Northrop, who had been intimately involved with the development of their S-1 sport plane, to develop a four-place passenger plane that would be known as the Vega. Northrop was working with Douglas Aircraft Company, but moonlighting with Douglas's permission to help Claude Ryan with his M1 monoplane, as well as Lockheed on the Vega. Gerard Volti, who would later form his own aircraft company, was also involved. Borrowing heavily from their experience with the S-1, the Vega's fuselage would be a semi-monocoque construction that was made up of laminated spiral strips of vertical spruce to form the outer skin that would then be applied to a series of circular, laminated spruce diaphragms. The high-winged monoplane that resulted was a beautiful, resilient design that would become a favorite of the likes of Amelia Earhart, who would become the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic and the United States in a Vega 5B. Another would be Wiley Post, who flew a Vega to circumnavigate the globe, setting numerous records along the way. Additionally, he would set an altitude record of 40,000 feet in a supercharged Vega named the Winnie Mae. He tragically died along with the actor and humorist Will Rogers in a modified version of the Lockheed Orion Explorer that would crash in Alaska while surveying an airmail route to Russia. The upshot was that while most aircraft built in the interwar years were biplanes, including military types, Lockheed had successfully departed from this conservative, safe approach to push the bounds of aircraft design, and to top it all off, made them of wood. The Lockheed Vega, Orion, Altair, Sirius, and Electra are easily the most striking collection of civilian aircraft built between the wars. But all that beauty could do nothing to stave off the economic horrors of the crash of 1929. In 1929, Lockheed would sell a controlling interest to Detroit Aircraft Corporation, a holding company that had interests in a number of other aircraft-related manufacturers and properties. At the end of 1931, however, the DAC went into receivership, and Lockheed was again poised to reinvent itself. In 1934, the Electra would rise from the ashes as Lockheed's first all-metal twin-engine design. The Electra was designed by Lloyd Stearman, who was better known for his ubiquitous Stearman trainers, but in this instance, he and several others had bought Lockheed in 1932. The Electra was Amelia Earhart's ride into an enduring mystery, and it was also the aircraft that introduced the aviation industry to Kelly Johnson. He would immediately make his mark when he informed the Electra's design team that his wind tunnel tests had confirmed the model's single-tail configuration lacked stability. He would recommend putting the rudders directly behind the engines in a twin-tail design that would become a distinctive design feature of many of Lockheed's designs, one fighter in particular. Timelines can be very enlightening, so let's take a quick look at the state of fighter aircraft design in 1937. It would be a banner year for the introduction of metal-skinned, single-wing fighters. The Hawker Hurricane, the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, the Brewster Buffalo, and the Seversky P-35 all had their first flights in that year. The year before that, the Spitfire made its appearance, and the year before that, the Me-109 made its appearance. Other than the Brewster Buffalo and the Seversky, all these aircraft would fly throughout World War II, although the Seversky would morph into the P-47. But what they all had in common was that they were incremental steps from the biplane to the monoplane. In fact, the Hurricane and the Wildcat were born directly from a biplane precursor. In February of 1937, the Army Air Corps issued Circular Proposal X-608 for a twin-engined, high-altitude interceptor. Lockheed, anxious for a military contract, would respond by forming a secretive engineering unit apart from its main factory, headed by Hal Hibbard and Kelly Johnson. This approach of a relatively small unit concentrating on a singular problem would eventually be known as the Skunk Works. Having no precursor to work from, Lockheed would roll out the XP-38 for its first flight in January 1939. By any standard, it was the most radical fighter design to see mass production during the war. It also holds the distinction as the only U.S. combat aircraft to be in continuous production throughout the American participation in World War II. The lens of history can make things look inevitable and easy. On the face of it, Kelly Johnson's involvement with the Lockheed's electric project seems like a short step to his very hands-on involvement with the P-38, and one quick step after the other to the Constellation, F-104, U-2, and finally the breathtaking SR-71. The compression of time between the Electra and the SR-71 is a span of less than 30 years, but the difference between the two is mind-boggling, and like many Lockheed aircraft, anything but incremental. For those of you interested, I would suggest reading Ben Rich's book Skunk Works that thoroughly describes the development of the U-2, SR-71, and the F-117, among others. As a young engineer under the thumb and the dictates of Kelly Johnson, and eventually the head of Lockheed, Rich had a front-row seat to the travails, politics, and sheer genius of the Skunk Works projects. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's rewind to 1945 and the incremental demise of the propeller-driven fighter. Another trick of time is that it can seem like a switch is thrown as one era ends and another starts, neatly presented as a fait accompli. Using that trick, we could say that with the end of the war, propeller-driven fighters had seen their day, and just like that, the advent of the jet was fully upon us. But we know that's not the case. For Lockheed, however, it was. Having built just over 10,000 P-38s throughout the war, the drawdown of forces of both men and equipment following the end of the war was precipitous. The Army Air Force was literally sending new aircraft to the scrap heap. Not surprisingly, the military budget went from $80 billion in 1945 to $11.2 billion in 1946. The Army Air Corps budget isn't broken out from that number, but it is easy to surmise that drastic decisions had to be made concerning which aircraft to keep and which to let go. As beautiful and as capable as the P-38 was, its fate was sealed. It cost twice as much as a P-51, and it was a maintenance hog. Its sophisticated and complex turbo-supercharged engines, 2 of them, added to its complexity and maintenance requirements. The Lightning would not see a post-war production run like its former stablemates, the Mustang and the Corsair. The good news for Lockheed was that it had several aircraft that had begun development during the war that would form a tripartite that would see them well through the early post-war years: the Constellation, the P-2V Neptune, and the P-80 Shooting Star. Way back in the 9th installment, I looked at the P2V and my dad's time in that beautiful creature. And prior to this effort, I was sure my dad had flown an EC-121 while he was flying in his last active-duty pilot slot as a ferry pilot, but not so. That leaves us with the P-80 Shooting Star. It would be the development of the P-80 that honed the approach Lockheed had taken with the P-38 to formally bring into existence a department known as Advanced Development Project Group, but more famously known as Skunk Works. This is one of those amalgams of seemingly disparate parts that came together to do great things. One part was the corporate culture at Lockheed that was confident enough to allow the existence of a group that ran afoul of both the corporation and often the customer. But the force of nature that made it all go was the previously mentioned Kelly Johnson, a brilliant engineering mind and an abrasive, unforgiving personality that suffered no fools used this free rein to do amazing things. The third element that really set the Skunk Works free was the war. Development times for weapon systems were always on the fast track during the war, but there was also a conservative approach that tended to stay with established systems because of the familiarity with their operation both in use and maintenance. So, as critical as jet programs would be towards the end of the war, particularly when the Me-262s were encountered over Europe, their development was very slow and so secret and siloed that other than murmurs, one hand didn't know what the other was doing. And if not for a very close relationship with Great Britain and their willingness to share their engines both in whole and licensed, American jet programs would have been even further behind. The idea of the jet engine was nothing new when the war broke out, but it was an esoteric effort being carried out by the visionaries who found themselves working quietly in the corners of aircraft companies who thought there might be something to the jet technology, but not confident enough with it to spend large resources on it. When war broke out, their efforts were pushed even further to the side as the pressure was to manufacture as many prop-driven war machines as quickly as possible. One of those corner-bound visionaries was Nathan "Nate" Price, who was brought on by Lockheed to develop his take on the jet engine. Designated the L-1000, it caught Johnson's attention enough for him and Hibbard to design a twin-engine fighter, the model L-133, and to present it to the Army Air Force at Wright Field in March of 1942. The Army Air Force considered the design too radical to be successfully developed in time to help the war effort, and passed. But the German success with their jet programs did not go unnoticed, and the less than successful Bell Aerocomet found the Army Air Force desperate for an alternative. Fortunately for Lockheed, Brigadier General Franklin O. Carroll, chief of the Engineering Division of the Material Command, recalled Hibbard and Johnson's presentation. He would meet with them in May of 1943 and offered them the opportunity to build a jet fighter built around the de Havilland-Halford H-1B Goblin engine. The P-80 was born. Things had changed considerably since Hibbard and Johnson first proposed the L-133. D-Day was still a year away, the air war over Europe was still in question, and losses still high. The Army Air Corps gave top priority to the realization of the Shooting Star, and what Lockheed needed was made available immediately. Additionally, the government had agreed to Johnson's stipulation that only one Air Corps overseer would be allowed in the Skunk Works facility. Minimal government oversight was a stipulation that Johnson was able to command until he retired from Lockheed in the early 70s. What the Army Air Corps got in return is unimaginable today. Johnson guaranteed the prototype would be finished in 150 days or less, with a lean 123-man work team sworn to secrecy, who would work 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, with Sunday off. It's easy to forget what total war means, but those involved at the time didn't. The XP-80 was delivered in 143 days, 7 days ahead of schedule. War has the ability to take the unassuming, mild-mannered person and turn them into an aggressive, war-fighting machine. One such person was Major Richard Dick Bong, a mild-mannered, self-deprecating son of Superior, Wisconsin. After several missteps during his training, buzzing a friend's house that had just gotten married, supposedly looping the Golden Gate Bridge, and flying low over Market Street in San Francisco, he was loaded onto a B-24 and delivered to Australia to join his unit, a P-38 squadron flying out of Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea. From there, he would become the top-scoring American ace ever, flying 3 tours in the P-38 with 40 confirmed kills. He and his squadron mates' kills were touted in newspapers like baseball scores. Several would die as they ran up their scores, so Bong was finally forced to return to the States to sell war bonds. Following his war bond tour, Bong remained in the Army Air Corps and was assigned as a test pilot for the P-80. On August 6, 1945, a week before VJ Day, Bong would take a P-80A aloft for an acceptance flight. He had 4 hours of jet time under his belt. After a fuel pump failure on takeoff, Bong ejected from the doomed aircraft but was too low for the parachute to open and was killed. His death was front-page news. What wasn't was that by the time Bong had died, 8 aircraft had already been destroyed, 7 damaged, and 6 other pilots had died. Even more alarming was that by September 1946, 60 accidents had occurred, mostly due to pilot error. The P-80, once airborne, was a well-mannered, relatively easy aircraft to fly. Landing and taking off was another story, and the transition from the demands of a high-performance propeller-driven aircraft to a jet was not easy to make, especially when your first time in a jet was a solo. A transitional trainer was needed. Enter the TP-80C, to be better known as the T-33. When the end of World War II was still in question, Lockheed had an order for 5,000 P-80s. The end of the war brought that number down to 2,000 airframes, and when all was said and done, Lockheed delivered 1,750 F-80s. But it would be the training version, the TP-80C, better known as the T-33, that would cement the success of the line, with 6,557 built. The last T-33 attached to a military air force, the Bolivian Air Force, would be retired in 2017. More importantly, it would safely transition thousands of pilots from either their high-performance prop-driven fighters or the next step in their initial training pipeline. Its success cannot be overstated. As I've mentioned many times before, aircraft manufacturers will offer up their aircraft in any livery the buyer will accept. The P-80 would come in the vanilla fighter version, a photo recon version, the obvious trainer version, that was also offered up as a ground attack version. The two-seat configuration developed for the T-33 would also lead to an all-weather interceptor version that would be designated the F-94 Starfire, although an interim aircraft that would easily be outclassed by the Convair F-102 and F-106, it managed to serve for 10 years before finally being phased out in 1959. And finally, Lockheed would privately develop an improved T-33 for the Navy, and with the pre-1962 convoluted naming convention, the T2V-1 was born. The Air Force discovered quickly that transitioning to jet aircraft was not an easy step to take. The Navy found the same to be true, but then, adding the inherent danger of flying on and off a carrier deck, the transition was that much more difficult, and for the Navy, a two-step process. So let's go to the numbers once again to get some additional perspective. Between 1949 and 1988, the Navy and Marine Corps lost nearly 12,000 aircraft and over 8,500 aircrew. And for the lack of a better term, the banner year was 1954, when naval aviation lost 776 aircraft and 535 aircrew. And to use an example I've used several times before to drill down a bit deeper, of the 1,261 Vought Crusaders built, 1,106 were involved in mishaps. But why 1988? In Robert C. Rubel's monograph, The U.S. Navy's Transition to Jets, he writes of several markers for the Navy's successful transitions to jet aircraft and concludes that one might declare the transition to have been complete when the Navy aviation accident rate became comparable to the U.S. Air Force. That would be 1988. This is the long way around to say that the Navy's transition to jets was even worse than the Air Force's. Lockheed did its best to convince the Navy to use the P-80 as a carrier-borne fighter. The Navy went as far to configure several P-80s borrowed from the Army Air Corps to fly tests off the USS Franklin D. Roosevelt, but decided to stick with its first purpose-built Navy jet fighter, the McDonnell FH-1. But the Navy would buy over 600 P-80s to help with jet transition. There is one glaring problem with the previous scenario. The Navy had plenty of jets for land-based transition, but nothing for jet training around the carriers. Enter my dad, a prop guy with over 1,800 hours and an S2F with over 300 traps in the same, and by a twist of fate, most of those were on a straight-deck carrier. He was solidly in the ASW propeller-driven pipeline. But if fate can twist one way, it can definitely twist in the other, which it did, as he found himself accepted and assigned to the Naval Test Pilot School in Patuxent River. Acceptance to the Test Pilot School is based on several factors: flight qualification, professional performance, academic background, and requirements of the service. But aviation skills are critical, as the candidate is expected to fly props, turboprops, helicopters, and jets. On December 26, 1961, my dad made his 200th straight-deck landing on the Lake Champlain after a 4.3-hour flight. 3 weeks later, on January 18, 1962, having arrived at TPS earlier that month, he strapped into the school's T2V for a 1.6-hour flight and his first time at the controls of a jet. I've described the T2V as the T-33's ugly younger brother, and I'm sure opinions may differ, but I suspect whoever took their first jet flight in the T2V found it the most beautiful thing they had ever seen. And like many younger brothers, they were afforded things older siblings were not. An improved Allison J-33 engine with 1,000 pounds more thrust than the T-33, a longer wingspan, structurally enhanced for carrier landings, and the first Navy aircraft with a boundary layer system to improve its low-speed landing characteristics. When the T-2V finally made its appearance in the fleet in 1957, it was only 2 years away from being replaced by the T-2 Buckeye, and only 150 were made. But a jet-powered carrier-based trainer was now available. Now, I can't say what my dad thought of the SeaStar, but it was two things to him for sure: a teaching tool for his time at TPS and his introduction to jet flight. This introduction afforded him the opportunity to fly the A4, the A6, the F-11F, the F-4D, the T-39, the F-8, the F-4B, and eventually the F-14. What it didn't do was introduce him to landing a jet on a carrier. My dad didn't fly his first carrier quals until he was deep into his training with the S2F out of Kingsville, Texas. Unusual, but not unheard of. The same would be true of jets. Having found himself being diverted to fighter bombers because of the needs of the Navy surrounding Operation Rolling Thunder, the first jet he would land on a carrier would be the F-4B Phantom on February 19, 1967, on the USS Constellation. His next stop would be Vietnam aboard the USS Coral Sea, where he would hone his carrier jet skills with full combat load cat shots and traps following several hours of being shot at. Can you say out of the frying pan and into the fire? The T2V SeaStar, along with its older brother, the T-33, safely introduced thousands of pilots to flying jets. The T2V went a step further and did its best to safely introduce Navy pilots to landing a jet on a carrier. Landing on a carrier is one of the most difficult flying skills to master, whether flying a jet or a piston engine. Mastering one does not guarantee success in the other. In Robert C. Ruba's earlier cited monograph, he relates his observation that during the Navy's transition from the piston engine S-2 Tracker to the jet-powered S-3 Viking, the more senior pilots seemed to have the most difficulty, and indeed a number of them either quit, had accidents, or failed to pass the flight checks. I can only wonder how my father would have fared in that transition had he stayed with the ASW community. But seeing as his T2V was an F4B, I think he would have done just fine. In any case, this has been another long one and I'll end it here. Haven't decided what airplane the next installment will be built around, so we're all going to be surprised. So, until next time, thanks for joining me for the 34th installment of the Dad Project. And for the 34th time, as many of you already know, I am telling you stories I had hoped my father would tell me. And I appreciate all being along for the journey. So please subscribe if you'd like to hear more. And until next time, thanks for watching and enjoy what life has given you. Ciao.